The Reconquista, reconquest, is a period of approximately 781 years in the history of the Iberian Peninsula, the period of the Portuguese and Spanish colonial empires which followed. Traditionally, historians mark the beginning of the Reconquista with the Battle of Covadonga, 718 or 722, in which a small army, led by the nobleman Pelagius, defeated an Umayyad army in the mountains of northern Iberia and established a small Christian principality in Asturias. 19th and much of 20th century Spanish and Portuguese historiography stressed the existence of a continuous phenomenon by which the Christian Iberian kingdoms opposed and conquered the Muslim kingdoms understood as a common enemy from the early 8th century to the late 15th century. However, the ideology of a Christian reconquest of the peninsula started to take shape at the end of the 9th century. A landmark was set by the Christian Chronica Prophetica, 883 to 884, a document stressing the Christian and Muslim cultural and religious divide in Iberia and the necessity to drive the Muslims out. However, Christian and Muslim rulers commonly became divided and fought amongst themselves. Coexistence and alliances between Muslims and Christians were as prevalent as frontier skirmishes and raids, especially in the earlier periods. Blurring distinctions even further were the mercenaries from both sides who simply fought for whoever paid the most. The Crusades, which started late in the 11th century, bred the religious ideology of a Christian reconquest, confronted at that time with a similarly staunch Muslim jihad ideology in Al-Andalus, the Almoravids and even to a greater degree, in the Almohads. In fact, previous documents, 10-11th century, are mute on any idea of reconquest. Propaganda accounts of Muslim-Christian hostility came into being to support that idea, most notably the Chanson de Roland, a highly mythical 12th century French recreation of the Battle of Roncesvalles, 778, dealing with the Iberian Saracens and taught unquestioned in the French educational system as of 1880. Many recent historians dispute the whole concept of Reconquista, as well as that of a prior conquista by the Moors, as a concept created a posteriori in the service of later political goals. It has been called a myth. One of the first Spanish intellectuals to question the idea of a reconquest that lasts for 8 centuries was José Ortega y Gasset, writing in the first half of the 20th century. However, the term is still used by professionals and laymen, to designate that historical period. Background: in 711, Muslim Moors, mainly North African Berber soldiers with some Arabs, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began their conquest of the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania. After their conquest of the Visigothic kingdom's Iberian territories, the Muslims crossed the Pyrenees and took control of Septimania in 719, the last province of the Visigothic kingdom to be occupied. From their stronghold of Narbonne, they launched raids into the Duchy of Aquitaine. At no point did the invading Islamic armies exceed 60,000 men. These armies established an Islamic rule that would last 300 years in much of the Iberian Peninsula and 781 years in Granada. Islamic rule. This article may require cleanup to meet Wikipedia's quality standards. The specific problem is original research or plagiarism, numerous factual statements lacking citation. Please help improve this article if you can. November 2013. After the establishment of a local emirate, Caliph al-Walid I, ruler of the Umayyad Caliphate, removed many of the successful Muslim commanders. Tariq ibn Ziyad, the first governor of the newly conquered province of Al-Andalus, was recalled to Damascus and replaced with Musa bin Nasser, who had been his former superior. Musa's son, Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa, apparently married Ijilana, Roderick's widow, and established his regional government in Seville. He was suspected of being under the influence of his wife, accused of wanting to convert to Christianity, and of planning a secessionist rebellion. Apparently a concerned al-Walid I ordered Abd al-Aziz's assassination. Caliph al-Walid I died in 715 and was succeeded by his brother Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik. Sulayman seems to have punished the surviving Musa bin Nasser, who very soon died during a pilgrimage in 716. In the end Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa's cousin, Ayyub ibn Habib al-Lakami became the emir of Al-Andalus. The conquering generals were necessarily acting very independently, due to the methods of communication available. Successful generals in the field and in a very distant province would also gain the personal loyalty of their officers and warriors, and their ambitions were probably always watched by certain circles of the distant government with a certain degree of concern and suspicion. Old rivalries and perhaps even full-fledged conspiracies between rival generals may have had influence over this development. In the end, the old successful generals were replaced by a younger generation considered more loyal by the government in Damascus. A serious weakness amongst the Muslim conquerors was the ethnic tension between Berbers and Arabs. The Berbers were indigenous inhabitants of North Africa who had only recently been converted to Islam. They had provided most of the soldiery of the invading Islamic armies but sensed Arab discrimination against them. This latent internal conflict jeopardized Muslim unity. After the Islamic Moorish conquest of nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula in 711 to 718 and the establishment of the Emirate of Al-Andalus, an Umayyad expedition suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Toulouse and was halted for a while on its way north. Odo of Aquitaine had married his daughter to Uthman ibn Nasa, a rebel Berber and lord of Sardinia, maybe of all current Catalonia too, in an attempt to secure his southern borders in order to fend off Charles Martel's attacks on the north. However, a major punitive expedition led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the latest emir of Al-Andalus, defeated and killed Uthman, and the Muslim governor mustered an expedition north across the western Pyrenees, looted areas up to Bordeaux, and defeated Odo in the Battle of the River Garonne in 732. A desperate Odo turned to his arch-rival Charles Martel for help, who led the Frankish and leftover Aquitanian armies against and defeated the Umayyad armies at the Battle of Tours in 732, killing Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi. Moorish rule began to recede, but it would remain in parts of the Iberian Peninsula for another 760 years. Beginning of the Reconquista. The year 722 saw the first Asturian victory against the Muslims. A drastic increase of taxes by the new emir and Basa ibn Suham al-Kalbi had provoked several rebellions in Al-Andalus, which a series of succeeding weak emirs was unable to suppress. Around 722, a military expedition was sent into the north to suppress Pelagius' rebellion, but his forces prevailed in the Battle of Covadonga. In late summer, a Muslim army overran much of Pelagius' territory, forcing him to retreat deep into the mountains. Pelagius and a few hundred men retired into a narrow valley at Covadonga. There, they could defend against a broad frontal attack. From here, Pelagius' forces routed the Muslim army, inspiring local villagers to take up arms. Despite further attempts, the Muslims were unable to conquer Pelagius' mountain stronghold. Pelagius' victory at Covadonga is hailed as the beginning of the Reconquista. This battle was considered by the Muslims as little more than a skirmish, since no Muslim source mentions it, while the Battle of Toulouse, 721, with a death toll of maybe tens of thousands, was mourned for centuries as a large-scale tragedy by the Iberian Muslims. However, for Pelagius, the Christian victory secured his independent rule. The precise date and circumstances of this battle are unclear. Among the possibilities is that Pelagius' rebellion was successful because the greater part of the Muslim forces were gathering for an invasion of the Frankish Empire. Coat of Arms of Alcanadra. La Rioja, Spain. Depicting heads of slain Moors. During the first decades, Asturian control over the different areas of the kingdom was still weak, and for this reason it had to be continually strengthened through matrimonial alliances with other powerful families from the north of the Iberian Peninsula. Thus, Ermesinde, Pelagius' daughter, was married to Alfonso, Peter of Cantabria's son. Alfonso's children, Froila and Aduzinda, married Muña, a Basque from Alava, and Silo, a local chief from the area of Pravia, respectively. After Pelagius' death in 737, his son Fabula of Asturias was elected king. Fabula, according to the chronicles, was killed by a bear during a trial of courage. Pelagius' dynasty in Asturias survived and gradually expanded the kingdom's boundaries until all of northwest Iberia was included by roughly 775. However, credit is due not to him but to his successors. Alfonso I, king from 739 to 757, rallied Galician support when driving the Moorish army out of Galicia and an area of what was to become Leon. The reign of Alfonso II, from 791 to 842, saw further expansion of the Northwest Kingdom towards the south and, for a short time, it almost reached Lisbon. It was not until Alfonso II that the kingdom was firmly established with Alfonso's recognition as King of Asturias by Charlemagne and the Pope. During his reign, the bones of St. James the Great were declared, falsely, to have been found in Galicia, at Santiago de Compostela. Pilgrims from all over Europe opened a channel of communication between the isolated Asturias and the Carolingian lands and beyond. The two resistances, Basque Navarre and Cantabrian Asturias, despite their small size, demonstrated an ability to maintain their independence. Because the Umayyad rulers based in Córdoba were unable to extend their power over the Pyrenees, they decided to consolidate their power within the Iberian Peninsula. Arab Berber forces made periodic incursions deep into Asturias but failed to make any lasting gains against the strengthened Christian kingdoms. After the Umayyad conquest of the Iberian heartland of the Visigothic kingdom, the Muslims crossed the Pyrenees and gradually took control of Septimania starting in 719, Narbonne conquered, up to 725, Carcassonne, Nîmes. From its stronghold of Narbonne, they tried to conquer Aquitaine but suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Toulouse, 721. Northeastern Al-Andalus, the Pyrenees, and southern Gaul at the time of the Berber Rebellion, 739 to 742. After halting their advance north, 10 years later, Odo of Aquitaine married his daughter to Uthman ibn Nasa, a rebel Berber and lord of Sardinia, maybe of all current Catalonia too, in an attempt to secure his southern borders in order to fend off Charles Martel's attacks on the north. However, a major punitive expedition led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the latest emir of Al-Andalus, defeated and killed Uthman. Charles Martel. The Umayyad governor mustered an expedition north across the western Pyrenees, looted its way up to Bordeaux and defeated Odo in the Battle of the River Garonne in 732. A desperate Odo turned to his arch-rival Charles Martel for help, who led the Frankish and remaining Aquitanian armies against the Muslims and beat them at the Battle of Tours in 732, killing Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi. In 737 Charles Martel led an expedition south down the Rhône valley to assert his authority up to the lands held by the Al-Andalus Umayyads. These had been called in by the regional nobility of Provence in a military capacity, probably fearing Charles's expansionist ambitions. Charles went on to attack the Umayyads in Septimania up to Narbonne, but he had to lift the siege of the city and make his way back to Lyon and Francia, at the time north of the Lower Loire, after subduing various Umayyad strongholds, such as Alès, Avignon, and Nîmes, not without leaving behind a trail of ruined towns and strongholds. Pepin the Younger and Charlemagne. After expelling the Muslims from Narbonne in 759 and driving their forces back over the Pyrenees, the Carolingian king Pepin the Short conquered Aquitaine in a ruthless 8-year war. Charlemagne followed his father by subduing Aquitaine by creating counties, taking the church as his ally and appointing counts of Frankish or Burgundian stock, like his loyal William of Gellone, making Toulouse his base for expeditions against Al-Andalus. Charlemagne decided to organize a regional sub-kingdom in order to keep the Aquitanians in check and to secure the southern border of the Carolingian Empire against Muslim incursions. In 781, his 3-year-old son Louis was crowned king of Aquitaine, under the supervision of Charlemagne's trustee William of Gellone, and was nominally in charge of the incipient Spanish March. Meanwhile, The takeover of the southern fringes of Al-Andalus by Abd ar-Rahman I in 756 was opposed by Yusuf ibn Abd al-Rahman, autonomous governor, Ulai, or king, Malik, of Al-Andalus. Abd ar-Rahman I expelled Yusuf from Cordova, but it took still decades for him to expand to the northwestern Andalusian districts. He was also opposed externally by the Abbasids of Damascus, who failed in their attempts to overthrow him. In 778, Abd al-Rahman closed in on the Ebro Valley. Regional lords saw the Umayyad emir on the gates and decided to enlist the nearby Christian Franks. According to Ali ibn al-Athir, a Kurdish historian of the 12th century, Charlemagne received the envoys of Sulayman al-Arabi, Husayn, and Abu Tur at the Diet of Paderborn in 777. These rulers of Zaragoza, Girona, Barcelona, and Huesca were enemies of Abd ar-Rahman I, and in return for Frankish military aid against him offered their homage and allegiance. Charlemagne, seeing an opportunity, agreed upon an expedition and crossed the Pyrenees in 778. Near the city of Zaragoza, Charlemagne received the homage of Sulayman al-Arabi. However, the city, under the leadership of Husayn, closed its gates and refused to submit. Unable to conquer the city by force, Charlemagne decided to retreat. On the way home, the rearguard of the army was ambushed and destroyed by Basque forces at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. The Song of Roland, a highly romanticized account of this battle, would later become one of the most famous chansons de geste of the Middle Ages. Around 788 Abd ar-Rahman I died, and was succeeded by Hisham I. In 792 Hisham proclaimed a jihad, advancing in 793 against the kingdom of Asturias and the Franks. In the end his efforts were turned back by William of Gellone, Count of Toulouse. Barcelona, a major city, became a potential target for the Franks in 797, as its governor Zaid rebelled against the Umayyad emir of Córdoba. An army of the emir managed to recapture it in 799, but Louis, at the head of an army, crossed the Pyrenees and besieged the city for 2 years until the city finally capitulated on December 28, 801. The main passes were Roncesvalles, Somport, and Junquera. Charlemagne established across them the vassal regions of Pamplona, Aragon, and Catalonia, which was itself formed from a number of small counties, Pallars, Girona, and Urgell being the most prominent, respectively. 4 small realms pledged allegiance to Charlemagne at the start of the 9th century, not for long Pamplona, to become Navarre, and the counties of Aragon, Soberb, and Ribagorza. Pamplona's first king was Inigo Arista, who, allying with his Muslim kinsman the Banu Qasi, rebelled against Frankish overlordship, and overcame a Frankish expedition in 824 that led to the setup of the Kingdom of Pamplona. It was not until Queen Jimena in the 9th century that Pamplona was officially recognized as an independent kingdom by the Pope. Aragon, founded in 809 by Aznar Galindez, grew around Jaca and the high valleys of the Aragon River, protecting the old Roman road. By the end of the 10th century, Aragon was annexed by Navarre. Soberb and Ribagorza were small counties and had little significance to the progress of the Reconquista. The Catalan counties protected the eastern Pyrenees passes and shores. They were under the direct control of the Frankish kings and were the last remains of the Spanish marches. Catalonia included not only the southern Pyrenees counties of Girona, Pallars, Urgell, Vic and Andorra, but also some which were on the northern side of the mountains, such as Perpiñá and Foix. In the late 9th century under Count Wilfrid, Barcelona became the de facto capital of the region. It controlled the other counties' policies in a union, which led in 948 to the independence of Barcelona under Count Borrell II, who declared that the new dynasty in France, the Capets, were not the legitimate rulers of France nor, as a result, of his county. These states were small and, with the exception of Navarre, did not have the capacity for attacking the Muslims in the way that Asturias did, but their mountainous geography rendered them relatively safe from being conquered. Their borders remained stable for 2 centuries. Military culture in medieval Iberia. In a situation of constant conflict, warfare and daily life were strongly interlinked during this period. Small, lightly equipped armies reflected how the society had to be on the alert at all times. These forces were capable of moving long distances in short times, allowing a quick return home after sacking a target. Battles which took place were mainly between clans, expelling intruder armies or sacking expeditions. In the context of the relative isolation of the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe, and the contact with Moorish culture, geographical and cultural differences implied the use of military strategies, tactics, and equipment that were markedly different from those found in the rest of Western Europe during this period. Medieval Iberian armies mainly comprised two types of forces: the cavalry, mostly nobles, but including commoner knights from 10th century on, and the infantry, or peones, peasants. Infantry only went to war if needed, which was not common. Iberian cavalry tactics involved knights approaching the enemy and throwing javelins, before withdrawing to a safe distance before commencing another assault. Once the enemy formation was sufficiently weakened, the knights charged with thrusting spears. Lances did not arrive in Hispania until the 11th century. There were three types of knights: royal knights, noble knights, caballeros hidalgos, and commoner knights, caballeros villanos. Royal knights were mainly nobles with a close relationship with the king, and thus claimed a direct Gothic inheritance. Royal knights were equipped in the same manner as their Gothic predecessors: breastplate, kite shield, a long sword, designed to fight from the horse, and as well as the javelins and spears, a Visigothic axe. Noble knights came from the ranks of the infanzons or lower nobles, whereas the commoner knights were not noble, but were wealthy enough to afford a horse. Uniquely in Europe, these horsemen comprised a militia cavalry force with no feudal links, being under the sole control of the king or the Count of Castile because of the charters, or fueros. Both noble and common knights wore leather armor and carried javelins, spears and round-tasseled shields, influenced by Moorish shields, as well as a sword. The peones were peasants who went to battle in service of their feudal lord. Poorly equipped, with bows and arrows, spears and short swords, they were mainly used as auxiliary troops. Their function in battle was to contain the enemy troops until the cavalry arrived and to block the enemy infantry from charging the knights. The longbow, the composite bow and the crossbow are the basic types of bows and especially popular in infantry. Typically armor was made of leather, with iron scales. Full coats of chainmail were extremely rare and horse barding completely unknown. Head protections consisted of a round helmet with nose protector, influenced by the designs used by Vikings who attacked during the 8th and 9th centuries, and a chainmail headpiece. Shields were often round or kidney-shaped, except for the kite-shaped designs used by the royal knights. Usually adorned with geometric designs, crosses or tassels, shields were made out of wood and had a leather cover. Steel swords were the most common weapon. The cavalry used long double-edged swords and the infantry short, single-edged ones. Guards were either semicircular or straight, but always highly ornamented with geometrical patterns. The spears and javelins were up to 1.5 meters long and had an iron tip. The double axe, made of iron and 30 centimeters long and possessing an extremely sharp edge, was designed to be equally useful as a thrown weapon or in close combat. Maces and hammers were not common, but some specimens have remained, and are thought to have been used by members of the cavalry. Finally, mercenaries were an important factor, as many kings did not have enough soldiers available. The Norsemen, the Flemish spearmen, the Frankish knights, the Moorish mounted archers and Berber light cavalry were the main types of mercenary available and used in the conflict. Technological changes. This style of warfare remained dominant in the Iberian Peninsula until the late 11th century, when couched lance tactics entered from France, although the traditional horse javelin shot techniques continued to be used. In the 12th and 13th centuries, soldiers typically carried a sword, a lance, a javelin, and either bow and arrows or crossbow and darts/bolts. Armor consisted of a coat of mail over a quilted jacket, extending at least to the knees, a helmet or iron cap, and bracers protecting the arms and thighs, either metal or leather. Shields were round or triangular, made of wood, covered with leather, and protected by an iron band. The shields of knights and nobles would bear the family's coat of arms. Knights rode in both the Muslim style, a lojinta, i.e. the equivalent of a modern jockey's seat, a short stirrup strap and bended knees allowed for better control and speed, or in the French style, a la brida, a long stirrup strap allowed for more security in the saddle, i.e. the equivalent of the modern cavalry seat, which is more secure, when acting as heavy cavalry. Horses were occasionally fitted with a coat of mail as well. Expansion into the Crusades and military orders. In the High Middle Ages, the fight against the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula became linked to the fight of the whole of Christendom. The Reconquista was originally a mere war of conquest. It only later underwent a significant shift in meaning toward a religiously justified war of liberation. See the Augustinian concept of a just war. The papacy and the influential Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy not only justified the acts of war but actively encouraged Christian knights to seek armed confrontation with Moorish infidels instead of with each other. From the 11th century onwards indulgences were granted. In 1064 Pope Alexander II allegedly promised the participants of an expedition against Barbastro, Tagra al-Andalus, Aragon, a collective indulgence 30 years before Pope Urban II called the First Crusade. The legitimacy of such a letter establishing a grant of indulgence has been disputed at length by historians, notably by Ferrero. Papal interest in Christian-Muslim relations in the peninsula are not without precedent. Popes Leo IV, 847–855, John VIII, 872–882, and John XIX, 1024–33, are all known to have displayed substantial interest in the region. Neither is there evidence to support the contention that the Cluny-IACs publicized the letter throughout Europe. It was addressed to the Clero Volturnense. The name has been associated with the castle of Volturno in Campania, but even this is not concrete. Baldwin, for example, stipulates that the name is simply garbled and that it was intended for a French bishopric. Not until 1095 and the Council of Clermont did the Reconquista amalgamate the conflicting concepts of a peaceful pilgrimage and armed knight-errantry. But the papacy left no doubt about the heavenly reward for knights fighting for Christ. Militia Christi. In a letter, Urban II tried to persuade the Reconquistadores fighting at Tarragona to stay in the peninsula rather than joining the armed pilgrimage to conquer Jerusalem, saying that their contribution for Christianity was equally important. The Pope promised them the same indulgences that he had promised to those who chose to join the First Crusade. Later military orders like the Order of Santiago, Montesa, Order of Calatrava and the Knights Templar were founded or called to fight in Iberia. The popes called the Knights of Europe to the Crusades in the peninsula. After the so-called disaster of Alarcos, French, Navarrese, Castilian, Portuguese and Aragonese armies united against the Muslim forces in the massive Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, 1212. The big territories awarded to military orders and nobles were the origin of the latifundia in today's Andalusia and Extremadura in Spain and Alentejo, in Portugal. Northern Christian realms. The Kingdom of Asturias was located in the Cantabrian Mountains, a wet and mountainous region in the north of the Iberian Peninsula. By the end of the 15th century there was a myriad of autonomous Christian kingdoms and principalities. The first Christian power was Asturias. The kingdom was established by a nobleman, Pelagius, Pelayo, who had possibly returned to his country after the Battle of Guadalete in 711, where he was elected leader of the Asturians and laid the foundations for the Kingdom of Asturias. However, Pelagius' kingdom initially was little more than a gathering point for the existing guerrilla forces. During the first decades, the Asturian dominion over the different areas of the kingdom was still lax, and for this reason it had to be continually strengthened through matrimonial alliances with other powerful families from the north of the Iberian Peninsula. Thus, Ermesinda, Pelagius' daughter, was married to Alfonso, Dux Peter of Cantabria's son. Alfonso's son Frula married Muña, a Basque from Alava, after crushing a Basque uprising, probably resistance. Their son is reported to be Alfonso II, while Alfonso I's daughter Aduzinda married Silo, a local chief from the area of Flavionavia, Pravia. Alfonso's military strategy was typical of Iberian warfare at the time. Lacking the means needed for wholesale conquest of large territories, his tactics consisted of raids in the border regions of Varjulia. With the plunder he gained, further military forces could be paid, enabling him to raid the Muslim cities of Lisbon, Zamora, and Coimbra. Alfonso I also expanded his realm westwards, conquering Galicia. During the reign of King Alfonso II, 791–842, the kingdom was firmly established, and a series of Muslim raids caused the transfer of Asturian capital to Oviedo. The king is believed to have initiated diplomatic contacts with the kings of Pamplona and the Carolingians, thereby gaining official recognition for his kingdom and his crown from the Pope and Charlemagne. There, the bones of St. James the Great were proclaimed to have been found in Iria Flavia, present-day Padrone, in 813, or probably 2 or 3 decades later. The cult to the saint was transferred later to Compostela, from Latin Campostelli, literally the star field, possibly in the early 10th century, when the focus of Asturian power moved from the mountains over to Leon, to become the Kingdom of Leon or Galicia Leon. Santiagos were just one of the many saint relics proclaimed to have been found across northwestern Iberia. Pilgrims started to flow in from other Iberian Christian realms, sowing the seeds of the later way of St. James, 11–12th century, that sparked the enthusiasm and religious zeal of continental Christian Europe for centuries. Santiago the Moor Slayer. Despite numerous battles, neither the Umayyads nor the Asturians had sufficient forces to secure control over these northern territories. Under the reign of Ramiro, famed for the highly legendary Battle of Covadonga, the border began to slowly move southward, and Asturian holdings in Castile, Galicia, and Leon were fortified, and an intensive program of repopulation of the countryside began in those territories. In 924 the Kingdom of Asturias became the Kingdom of Leon. When Leon became the seat of the royal court, it didn't bear any official name. Kingdom of Navarre, 824–1620. The Kingdom of Pamplona was one of the important Christian powers of Iberia during the Reconquista. The kingdom was formed when local leader Inigo Arista led a revolt against the regional Frankish authority and was elected or declared king in Pamplona, traditionally in 824, establishing a kingdom inextricably linked at this stage to their kinsmen the Muwallad Banu Qasi of Tudela. Although relatively weak up until the early 11th century under the Sancho III, 1004–1035, Navarre took up a more active Christian role after the accession to the throne of the Jimenez lineage, 905. The Kingdom of Pamplona, after 12th century, Navarre, was a Christian kingdom extending after the 13th century, and briefly in the early 11th century, at either side of the Pyrenees alongside the Atlantic Ocean. Throughout the early history of the Navarrese kingdom, there were frequent skirmishes with the Carolingian Empire, from which it maintained its independence, a key feature of its history until 1513. The reign of Sancho the Great not only expanded the Navarrese territories when they absorbed Castile, Leon, and what was to be Aragon, in addition to other small counties which would also unite and become the Principality of Catalonia, but it also helped form the Galician independence as well as getting overlordship on Gascony. The conquest of Leon did not consume Galicia, as the Leon's king retreated and was left to temporary independence. Galicia was conquered soon after. It was conquered by Sancho's son Ferdinand around 1038. However, this small period of independence meant that it was fashioned as its own kingdom, and the subsequent kings named their titles as King of Galicia and Leon, instead of merely King of Leon, even though Galicia was never to be independent again. Alfonso III of Asturias repopulated the strategically important city Leon and established it as his capital. From his new capital, King Alfonso began a series of campaigns to establish control over all the lands north of the Douro. He reorganized his territories into the major duchies, Galicia and Portugal, and major counties, Saldanha and Castile, and fortified the borders with many castles. At his death in 910 the shift in regional power was completed as the kingdom became the Kingdom of Leon. From this power base, his heir Ordino II was able to organize attacks against Toledo and even Seville. The Caliphate of Córdoba was gaining power, and began to attack Leon. Navarre and King Ordino allied against Abd al-Rahman but were defeated in Val di Junquera, in 920. For the next 80 years, the Kingdom of Leon suffered civil wars, Moorish attack, internal intrigues and assassinations, and the partial independence of Galicia and Castile, thus delaying the Reconquest, and weakening the Christian forces. It was not until the following century that the Christians started to see their conquests as part of a long-term effort to restore the unity of the Visigothic kingdom. The only point during this period when the situation became hopeful for Leon was the reign of Ramiro II. King Ramiro, in alliance with Fernán González of Castile and his retinue of caballeros villanos, defeated the Caliph in Simancas in 939. After this battle, when the Caliph barely escaped with his guard and the rest of the army was destroyed, King Ramiro obtained 12 years of peace, but had to give González the independence of Castile as a payment for his help in the battle. After this defeat, Moorish attacks abated until Almanzor began his campaigns. It was Alfonso V in 1002 who finally regained the control over his domains. Navarre, though attacked by Almanzor, remained. Kingdom of Aragon, 1035–1706. The Kingdom of Aragon was an offshoot of the Kingdom of Navarre. It was formed when Sancho III of Navarre decided to divide his large realm among all his sons. Aragon was the portion of the realm which passed to Ramiro I of Aragon, an illegitimate son of Sancho III. The kingdoms of Aragon and Navarre were several times united in personal union until the death of Alfonso the Battler in 1135. The Kingdom of Aragon eventually passed, by marriage, to the Counts of Barcelona, who were vassals of the King of France. The House of Barcelona eventually collected a number of territories in the Mediterranean, known as the Crown of Aragon. James I of Aragon, also known as James the Conqueror, expanded Aragon to the north, south and east. James also signed the Treaty of Corbeil, 1258, which released him from the nominal suzerainty of the King of France. Early in his reign, James the Conqueror attempted to reunite the Aragonese and Navarrese crowns through a treaty with the childless Sancho VII of Navarre. But the Navarrese nobles rejected him, and chose the Theobald IV of Champagne in his stead. It was his distant descendant, Ferdinand II of Aragon, who brought Aragon to the height of its power through the conquest of Upper Navarre, Navarre south of the Pyrenees, and Granada. Kingdom of Castile, 1037–1230. Ferdinand I of Leon was the leading king of the mid-11th century. He conquered Coimbra and attacked the Taifa kingdoms, often demanding the tributes known as parias. Ferdinand's strategy was to continue to demand parias until the Taifa was greatly weakened both militarily and financially. He also repopulated the borders with numerous fueros. Following the Navarrese tradition, on his death in 1064 he divided his kingdom between his sons. His son Sancho II of Castile wanted to reunite the kingdom of his father and attacked his brothers, with a young noble at his side, Rodrigo Diaz, later known as El Cid Campeador. Sancho was killed in the siege of Zamora by the traitor Belito Dalfos, also known as Velado Adolfo, in 1072. His brother Alfonso VI took over Leon, Castile, and Galicia. Alfonso VI the Brave gave more power to the fueros and repopulated Segovia, Avila and Salamanca. Then, once he had secured the borders, King Alfonso conquered the powerful Taifa kingdom of Toledo in 1085. Toledo, which was the former capital of the Visigoths, was a very important landmark, and the conquest made Alfonso renowned throughout the Christian world. However, this conquest was conducted rather gradually, and mostly peacefully, during the course of several decades. It was not until after sporadic and consistent population resettlements had taken place that Toledo was decisively conquered. Alfonso VI was first and foremost a tactful monarch who chose to understand the kings of Taifa and employed unprecedented diplomatic measures to attain political feats before considering the use of force. He adopted the title Imperator Totius Hispanii, Emperor of all Hispania, referring to all the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, and not just the modern country of Spain. Alfonso's more aggressive policy towards the Taifas worried the rulers of those kingdoms, who called on the African Almoravids for help. Kingdom of Portugal, 1139–1910. In 1139, after an overwhelming victory in the Battle of Ourique against the Almoravids, Afonso Henriques was proclaimed the first king of Portugal by his troops. According to the legend, Christ announced from heaven Afonso's great deeds, whereby he would establish the first Portuguese Cortes at Lamigo and be crowned by the Archbishop of Braga. In the Treaty of Zamora in 1143, Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile recognized Portuguese independence from the Kingdom of Leon. In 1147, Portugal captured Santarém, and 7 months later the city of Lisbon was also brought under Portuguese control after the Siege of Lisbon. By the papal bull Manifestus Probatum, Pope Alexander III recognized Afonso Henriques as King of Portugal in 1179. With Portugal finally recognized as an independent kingdom by its neighbors, Afonso Henriques and his successors, aided by crusaders and the military monastic orders the Knights Templar, the Order of Abish or the Order of St. James, pushed the Moors to the Algarve on the southern coast of Portugal. After several campaigns, the Portuguese part in the Reconquista came to an end with the definitive capture of the Algarve in 1249. With all of Portugal now under the control of Afonso III of Portugal, religious, cultural and ethnic groups became gradually homogenized. Cross of the Order of Christ. After the completion of the Reconquista, the Portuguese territory was a Roman Catholic realm. Nonetheless, Denis of Portugal carried out a short war with Castile for possession of the towns of Serpa and Mora. After this, Denis avoided war. He signed the Treaty of Alcañices with Ferdinand IV of Castile in 1297, establishing the present-day borders. During the suppression of the Knights Templar all over Europe, under the influence of Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V requesting its annihilation by 1312, King Denis reinstituted the Templars of Tomar as the Order of Christ in 1319. Denis believed that the order's assets should by their nature stay in any given order instead of being taken by the king, largely for the Templars' contribution to the Reconquista and the reconstruction of Portugal after the wars. Christian infighting. Clashes and raids on bordering Andalusian lands did not keep the Christian kingdoms from battling among themselves or allying with Muslim kings. Some Muslim kings had Christian-born wives or mothers. Also some Christian champions like El Cid were contracted by Taifa kings to fight against their neighbors. Indeed, El Cid's first battle experience was gained fighting for a Muslim state against a Christian state, at the Battle of Graus in 1063, where he and other Castilians fought on the side of Al-Muqtadir, Muslim Sultan of Zaragoza, against the forces of Ramiro I of Aragon. There is even an instance of a crusade being declared against another Christian king in Iberia. Following the disastrous defeat of Alfonso VIII, King of Castile, at Alarcos, Kings Alfonso IX, of Kingdom of Leon, and Sancho VII, of Navarre, entered an alliance with the Almohads and invaded Castile in 1196. By the end of the year Sancho VII had dropped out of the war under papal pressure. Early in 1197, at the request of Sancho I, King of Portugal, Pope Celestine III declared a crusade against Alfonso IX, and released his subjects from their responsibilities to the king, declaring the men of his realm shall be absolved from their fidelity and his dominion by authority of the Apostolic See. Together the kings of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon invaded Leon. In the face of this onslaught combined with pressure from the Pope, Alfonso IX was finally forced to sue for peace in October 1197. In the late years of Al-Andalus, Castile had the might to conquer the remains of the Kingdom of Granada, but the kings preferred to claim the tribute of the Muslim parias. The trade of Granadan goods and the parias were a major means by which African gold entered medieval Europe. The Reconquista was a process not only of war and conquest, but also repopulation. Christian kings took their own people to locations abandoned by Muslims, in order to have a population capable of defending the borders. The main repopulation areas were the Douro Basin, the Northern Plateau, the High Ebro Valley, La Rioja, and central Catalonia. The repopulation of the Douro Basin took place in two distinct phases. North of the river, between the 9th and 10th centuries, the pressure, or presura, system was employed. South of the Douro, in the 10th and 11th centuries, the presura led to the charters, forays or fueros. Fueros were used even south of the central range. The presura referred to a group of peasants who crossed the mountains and settled in the abandoned lands of the Douro Basin. Asturian laws promoted the system with laws, for instance granting a peasant all the land he was able to work and defend as his own property. Of course, Asturian and Galician minor nobles and clergymen sent their own expeditions with the peasants they maintained. This led to very feudalist areas, such as Leon and Portugal, whereas Castile, an arid land with vast plains and harsh climate, only attracted peasants with no hope in Biscay. As a consequence, Castile was governed by a single count, but had a largely mostly non-feudal territory with many free peasants. Presuras also appear in Catalonia, when the Count of Barcelona ordered the Bishop of Urgell and the Count of Girona to repopulate the plains of Vic. During the 10th century and onwards, cities and towns gained more importance and power, as commerce reappeared and the population kept growing. Fueros were charters documenting the privileges and usages given to all the people repopulating a town. The fueros provided a means of escape from the feudal system, as fueros were only granted by the monarch. As a result, the town council was dependent on the monarch alone and had to help their lord, auxilium. The military force of the towns became the caballeros villanos. The first fuero was given by Count Fernan Gonzalez to the inhabitants of Castro Gerais in the 940s. The most important towns of medieval Iberia had fueros or forays. In Navarre, fueros were the main repopulating system. Later on, in the 12th century, Aragon also employed the system, for example, the fuero of Teruel, which was one of the last fueros, in the early 13th century. From the mid-13th century on no more charters were granted, as the demographic pressure had disappeared and other means of repopulation were created. Fueros remained as city charters until the 18th century in Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, and until the 19th century in Castile and Navarre. Fueros had an immense importance for those living under them, who were prepared to go to war to defend their rights under the charter. In the 1800s, the abolition of the fueros in Navarre would be one of the causes of the Carlist Wars. In Castile, disputes over the system contributed to the war against Charles I, Castilian War of the Communities. Muslim decline and defeat. Fall of the Caliphate. The 9th century saw the Berbers return to Africa in the aftermath of their revolts. During this period, many governors of large cities distant from the capital, Córdoba, planned to establish their independence. Then, in 929, the Emir of Córdoba, Abdar Rahman III, the leader of the Umayyad dynasty, declared himself caliph, independent from the Abbasids in Baghdad. He took all the military, religious, and political power and reorganized the army and the bureaucracy. After regaining control over the dissident governors, Abdar Rahman III tried to conquer the remaining Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, attacking them several times and forcing them back beyond the Cantabric range. The Battle of the Puig at El Puig de Santa Maria in 1237. Later, Abdar Rahman's grandson became a puppet in the hands of the great vizier Almanzor, the victorious. Almanzor waged several campaigns attacking and sacking Burgos, Leon, Pamplona, Barcelona, and Santiago de Compostela before his death in 1002. Between Almanzor's death and 1031, Al-Andalus suffered many civil wars which ended in the appearance of the Taifa kingdoms. The Taifas were small kingdoms, established by the city governors establishing their long-wished-for independence. The result was many, up to 34, small kingdoms each centered upon their capital, and the governors, not subscribing to any larger-scale vision of the Moorish presence, had no qualms about attacking their neighboring kingdoms whenever they could gain advantage by doing so. This split into the Taifa states caused Islamic presence to be greatly weakened in the face of the strengthening Christian kingdoms to the north when Alfonso VI brought Toledo under his authority in 1085. Mortified by the concept of being surrounded by the enemy, Taifa rulers sent a desperate appeal to the Berber chieftain Yusuf ibn Tashfin, leader of the Almoravids. Almoravids. The Almoravids were a Muslim militia, their ranks mainly composed of Berber and African Moors, and unlike the previous Muslim rulers, they were not so tolerant towards Christians and Jews. Their armies entered the Iberian Peninsula on several occasions, 1086, 1088, 1093, and defeated King Alfonso at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086, but initially their purpose was to unite all the Taifas into a single Almoravid caliphate. Their actions halted the southward expansion of the Christian kingdoms. Their only defeat came at Valencia in 1094, due to the actions of El Cid. Meanwhile, Navarre lost all importance under King Sancho IV, for he lost Rioja to Sancho II of Castile, and nearly became the vassal of Aragon. At his death, the Navarrese chose as their king Sancho Ramirez, king of Aragon, who thus became Sancho V of Navarre and I of Aragon. Sancho Ramirez gained international recognition for Aragon, uniting it with Navarre, expanding the borders south, conquering Huascat deep in the valleys in 1096 and building a fort, El Castella, 25 kilometers away from Saracastat Zaragoza. Catalonia came under intense pressure from the Taifas of Zaragoza and Lerida, and also from internal disputes, as Barcelona suffered a dynastic crisis which led to open war among the smaller counties, but by the 1080s, the situation calmed, and the dominion of Barcelona over the smaller counties was restored. Almohads. After a brief period of disintegration, Second Taifa period, the rising power in North Africa, the Almohads, took over most of Al-Andalus. But they would be decisively defeated at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, 1212, by a Christian coalition, losing almost all the remaining lands of Al-Andalus in the following decades. By 1252 only the Kingdom of Granada remained as sovereign Muslim state in the Iberian Peninsula. Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista with a war against the Emirate of Granada that started in 1482 and ended with Granada's surrender on January 2, 1492. The Moors in Castile previously numbered 500,000 within the realm. By 1492 some 100,000 had died or been enslaved, 200,000 had emigrated, and 200,000 remained in Castile. Many of the Muslim elite, including Granada's former Emir Muhammad XII, who had been given the area of the Alpujarras Mountains as a principality, found life under Christian rule intolerable and emigrated to Tlemcen in North Africa. Conversions and expulsions. During the Islamic administration, Christians and Jews were allowed to retain their religions by paying a tax, jizya. Penalty for not paying it was imprisonment. Moros y Cristianos celebrated in many towns and cities of Spain, to commemorate the battles of Reconquista. The new Christian hierarchy demanded heavy taxes from non-Christians and gave them rights, such as in the Treaty of Granada, 1491, only for Moors in recently Islamic Granada. In July 30, 1492, all the Jewish community, some 200,000 people, were forcibly expelled. The very next year the Alhambra decree under Archbishop Hernando de Talavera, 1492, dismissed the Treaty of Granada, and now the Muslim population of Granada was forced to convert or be expelled. In 1502, Queen Isabella I declared conversion to Catholicism compulsory within the Kingdom of Castile. King Charles V did the same to Moors in the Kingdom of Aragon in 1526, forcing conversions of its Muslim population during the revolt of the Germanies. Many local officials took advantage of the situation to seize property. Spanish Inquisition. Most of the descendants of those Muslims who submitted to conversion to Christianity rather than exile during the early periods of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, the Moriscos, were later expelled from Spain after serious social upheaval, when the Inquisition was at its height. The expulsions were carried out more severely in eastern Spain, Valencia and Aragon, due to local animosity towards Muslims and Moriscos, where they were seen as economic rivals by local workers who saw them as cheap labor, undermining their bargaining position with the landlords. Exactions imposed on the Moriscos paved the way to a major Morisco revolt happening in 1568, with the final expulsion of the Moriscos from Castile taking place in 1609. They were driven from Aragon at about the same time. Making things more complex were the many former Muslims and Jews known as Moriscos, Marranos conversos, who shared ancestors in common with many Christians, especially among the aristocracy, causing much concern over loyalty and attempts by the aristocracy to hide their non-Christian ancestry. Those that the Spanish Inquisition found to be secretly practicing Islam or Judaism were executed, imprisoned, or expelled. Those descended from Muslims or Jews practicing at the time of the Reconquista's close were perpetually suspected of various crimes against the Spanish state, including continued practice of Islam or Judaism, and any survivors were finally all expelled. Classifications and later consequences. The many advances and retreats created several social types. The Muladi, Christians under Islamic rule who converted to Islam after the arrival of the Moors. The Mozarabs, Christians in Muslim-held lands. Some of them migrated to the north of the peninsula in times of persecution, bringing elements of the styles, food, and agricultural practices learned from the Moors, while they continued practicing their Christianity with older forms of Catholic worship and their own versions of the Latin language. The Marranos, Jewish conversos. Jews who either voluntarily or compulsorily converted to Catholicism. Some were crypto-Jews who continued practicing Judaism secretly. All remaining Jews were expelled from Spain in Treaty of Granada of 1492, and from Portugal in 1497. Converso Jews often became victims of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. The Mudahar, Muslims in Christian-held lands. Moriscos, Muslim conversos. Muslims who were compulsorily converted to Catholicism. Most were crypto-Muslims who continued practicing Islam secretly. They ranged from successful skilled artisans, valued and protected in Aragon, to impoverished peasants in Castile. After the Alhambra decree, the entire Islamic population was forced to convert or leave, and within a century most were expelled. Real, legendary, and fictional episodes from the Reconquista are the subject of much of medieval Galician Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan literature, such as the Canta d'Agasta. Some noble genealogies show the close relations, although not very numerous, between Muslims and Christians. For example, Al-Mansur ibn Abi Amir, whose rule is considered to have marked the peak of power for Moorish al-Andalus Iberia, married Abda, daughter of Sancho Garces II of Navarra, who bore him a son, named Abd al-Rahman and commonly known in pejorative sense as Sancho-ulo, Little Sancho, in Arabic, Shanjo-ul. After his father's death, Sancho-ulo/Abd al-Rahman, as a son of a Christian princess, was a strong contender to take over the ultimate power in Muslim al-Andalus. 100 years later, King Alfonso VI of Castile, considered among the greatest of the medieval Spanish kings, designated as his heir his son, also a Sancho, by the refugee Muslim Princess Zaida of Seville. The Reconquista was a war with long periods of respite between the adversaries, partly for pragmatic reasons and also due to infighting among the Christian kingdoms of the north spanning over 7 centuries. Some populations practiced Islam or Christianity as their own religion during these centuries, so the identity of contenders changed over time. Recreations in modern Spain. Currently, the festivals of Moros y Cristianos, Castilian, Moros y Cristians, Catalan, Moros y Cristados, Portuguese, and Moros y Cristians, Galician, these meaning Moors and Christians, recreate the fights as colorful parades with elaborate garments and lots of fireworks, especially on the central and southern towns of the land of Valencia, like Alcoy, Ontinyent, or Villena.